There is a passage buried inside the Pistis Sophia, a Coptic codex discovered near Akhmim, Egypt, in the late 18th century and translated in full only in 1851 by the German scholar Carl Schmitt, that most people who encounter Gnostic spirituality never read in context. They encounter the summary, they encounter the Wikipedia article, they encounter the second-hand interpretation filtered through 2,000 years of institutional processing. What they do not encounter is what the original text actually says about the structure of the divine realm before the material world was formed, and why the specific names attached to that structure matter in ways that are not symbolic, not metaphorical, and not safe for the systems of control that replace the tradition that preserved them. The text describes 13 Aeons, 13 distinct emanations of divine consciousness arranged in a precise cosmological sequence, and when you read the Pistis Sophia in its original form, not the filtered, academically sanitized versions that most comparative religion courses assign, the language used to describe these Aeons is not the language of abstraction. It is not the language of philosophy. It is the language of personhood, of encounter, of beings with faces, with voices, with specific qualities that interact with human consciousness in specific, documentable ways. The early Valentinian Gnostics, whose school produced some of the most sophisticated theological writing of the 2nd century CE, did not describe the Aeons as forces or principles. Valentinus himself, writing around 140 CE in Rome, described them as living presences, emanations of what he called the pleroma, the fullness, the original undivided wholeness of divine reality. And in the tradition that eventually crystallized into the Pistis Sophia, the most developed of these Aeon frameworks, almost all of the primary emanations carry feminine names, feminine attributes, and feminine modes of interaction with the human soul. Sophia, Pistis, Elpis, Agape, Synesis, Makariotes, Phronesis, Dynamis, Synesis again at a higher octave, Irene, Pistis at her restored state, the unnamed one, and finally the mother of the whole sequence, the one the text calls the first mystery. These are not neutral cosmic principles, these are named beings, and the naming is not incidental. In the ancient world, across the Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek and Hebrew traditions that fed into early Gnosticism, a name was not a label. A name was a functional technology. To know the true name of a divine being was to have a channel of access to that being's specific quality of consciousness. This is why the Egyptian magicians in the Greek magical papyri, the PGM, a collection of ritual texts dating from the 2nd century BCE to the 5th century CE, invoke divine figures by name with such specificity. They understood that Isis invoked by her name activates something in human consciousness that Isis described abstractly as a cosmic principle does not. The name is the frequency carrier. The name is the key, and this is precisely what was removed. When you trace the transmission history of Gnostic texts through the patristic period, through the church fathers who both quoted and condemned these writings, you see a pattern of progressive neutralization. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his systematic refutation of Gnostic teaching around 180 CE, quotes Valentinian theology extensively in order to argue against it. He preserves the structure of the Aeon system almost perfectly, but he consistently refers to the Aeons in ways that drain them of their personhood. They become, in his framing, errors, philosophical mistakes, abstractions that lead the simple-minded astray. He never quite admits what the original teaching actually said, that these were encounterable realities that practitioners reported direct experience of. Later, as the Church gained political authority following the Edict of Milan in 313 CE and the councils of Nicaea and beyond, the approach shifted from argument to erasure. The Nag Hammadi library, discovered in 1945 near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts gives us our clearest picture of what actually happened. These texts were buried around 390 CE, almost certainly by monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery, who were hiding them from enforcement of Bishop Athanasius's 367 CE Easter letter, which explicitly ordered the destruction of non-canonical texts. The monks buried what they could not bear to destroy, and what they buried included Aeon frameworks in which every emanation is named, gendered, and described in terms of what it does inside human consciousness when contacted. This matters enormously for anyone trying to work with these teachings today, because what survived through the official channels is structurally complete, but functionally emptied. The Aeon system, as it appears in most academic treatments of Gnosticism, looks like a cosmological map. And it is a cosmological map, but a map is only useful if you know what kind of terrain it describes. The terrain here is not abstract cosmic space. The terrain is the interior of human consciousness, organised into specific registers that correspond to specific emanations of the divine feminine, each one accessible through specific practices, each one activating specific capacities in the person who contacts it. Before going further into the specific techniques and what each of the 13 activates, it's worth pausing to address the question that serious practitioners and scholars always ask at this point. How do we know the original teachings were feminine? How do we know this isn't itself a projection, a feminist reclamation project imposing a modern framework onto ancient material? The answer is in the texts themselves, and the scholarly lineage tracing that answer is substantial. Elaine Pagels, whose 1979 work The Gnostic Gospels brought Nag Hammadi scholarship to a general audience, documented extensively that many Gnostic traditions included women as teachers, ritual leaders, and theological authorities, a fact that itself created friction with emerging Orthodox Christianity. But Pagels was working within academic constraints that kept her from the full radicalism of the original teaching. It was scholars like Karen King, whose 2003 work, What is Gnosticism?, examined how the category itself had been constructed, and April DeConnick, whose research on the Gospel of Judas and Valentinian traditions, published in the 2000s, brought new rigour to the question of original practice, who began to articulate what the gendering of the Aeons actually meant in functional terms. Anne Maguire's work on silence and the naming of Sophia, Ismo Dunderberg's research on emotions and the Aeons in Valentinian theology, and perhaps most importantly, the work of Tuomas Rasimus on paradise reconsidered in Gnostic myth-making. These scholars collectively demonstrate that the feminine in the Aeon tradition is not ornamental. It is structural. The sequence of emanations that the Pistis Sophia describes follows a logic that is coherent only when the relational, receptive, generative qualities associated with the feminine are understood as the actual mechanism by which consciousness expands from one Aeon to the next. The demiurge, the figure the Pistis Sophia identifies as Yaldabaoth, the blind god, the false creator who fashioned the material world without understanding the fullness from which he himself derived, is explicitly described as the entity who introduced the principle of gender neutralization into the divine order, not because he abolished gender, but because he could not comprehend it. He could create forms, but he could not create the relational dynamic between forms that made them alive. His world is a world of things, not encounters, and the archons who administer his world, the planetary administrators that Gnostic cosmology names in ways that parallel Babylonian astrology, likewise operate on a logic of control and containment that is fundamentally incompatible with the living relational quality that the feminine Aeons embody. Here is what this means practically, and practically is where this investigation becomes something more than historical and scholarly. The archonic system of control, however you choose to conceptualize it, whether as literal non-material entities, as psychological structures, as cultural conditioning, as neurological patterns, as all of these simultaneously, operates by keeping human consciousness locked into a mode of engagement that the Pistis Sophia would describe as the world of the demiurge, a mode characterized by separation, by competition, by the dominance of structure over life, of form over encounter, of hierarchy over relationship. The 13 Aeons represent the specific qualities of consciousness that exist outside that system, and recovering access to each one is not a metaphysical exercise. It is a practical act of liberation that has documentable effects on how a person experiences their own mind, their relationships, their sense of their place in the order of things. What follows is a detailed engagement with all 13 in the sequence the Pistis Sophia gives us, because that sequence is not arbitrary, and moving through it in order produces something different than engaging with them individually or out of sequence. Each Aeon is both an aspect of the divine and a specific register of human experience. Each has a name. Each name carries a specific vibrational quality that the Hellenistic tradition of sacred phonology, the understanding that certain sound patterns interact with consciousness in specific ways, documented from Pythagorean music theory through the Hermetic tradition and into the Coptic magical papyri, recognized as a functional technology, not a decoration. The first and foundational emanation in the sequence is Pistis herself, Sophia's companion, the one whose very name means faith, but not faith in the weakened institutional sense that Christianity eventually imposed on the word. In the original Greek, pistis carried a meaning closer to what we would today call fundamental trust in the coherence of reality. Pistis is the emanation that corresponds to the human capacity to remain open to experience without preemptive armoring. When neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences studied what happens in the brain during states of radical openness, published in work by Tanya Singer and colleagues on prosocial states and their neural correlates between 2013 and 2018, they identified a distinctive pattern of activation in the default mode network combined with deactivation of the threat detection circuitry centered in the amygdala. This is, in phenomenological terms, precisely what pistis describes: a state in which the organism remains engaged with reality without the defensive contractions that the archonic system, the threat detection apparatus, the survival anxiety, the need to control outcomes imposes by default. Working with pistis means practicing radical opening, not the manufactured openness of positive thinking, which is still a form of control, insisting that reality conform to a desired emotional tone. Genuine pistis is an opening that includes the willingness to encounter what is actually present, including difficulty, including uncertainty, including the full spectrum of what the Gnostics called Heil, material, form-bound, difficult experience. The practice associated with this Aeon is deliberately simple: sitting with a situation or a feeling without moving to either acceptance or rejection of it, holding it in awareness without narrative. This is close to, but not identical with, Buddhist mindfulness practice. The difference is intentionality. Mindfulness, in its most common contemporary form, is about awareness of present experience. Pistis practice is about opening the specific frequency of fundamental trust. Trust not that things will work out according to preference, but that reality itself is coherent and navigable even when it is painful. Practitioners who work with pistis as a distinct Aeon, rather than as a generic mindfulness exercise, consistently report a shift in the quality of their relationship to uncertainty, not a reduction in uncertainty, not a positive reframing, but a genuine change in how uncertainty registers in the body. The amygdala's contribution to experience, which neuroscientists now understand as not just threat detection, but anticipatory threat mapping, the running simulation of possible future dangers, begins to quiet without suppression. The pistis state doesn't eliminate threat mapping. It simply stops treating it as the primary input for decision-making. The specific practice: spend 10 minutes each morning for 7 consecutive days sitting with whatever is most uncertain in your life at this moment. Not solving it, not reframing it, not accepting it. Simply allowing the uncertainty to be present in your awareness while you continue to breathe. If your mind moves to solution or to catastrophizing, simply return to the physical sensation of breathing without commenting on the detour. At the end of 7 days, note not whether the uncertainty is resolved, but how your body holds it. Almost every practitioner who completes this cycle reports a change in their physical relationship to the sensation of not knowing. The constriction in the chest, the tension in the jaw, the held quality in the breath, these begin to release. This is pistis working. This is the first Aeon doing what she was described as doing in the pistis Sophia, creating the conditions under which the soul can begin to move through the remaining 12 without being stopped at the first threshold by its own defences. The second emanation in the sequence is Elpis, whose name is the Greek word for hope, but again stripped of its institutional domestication. In the original context, Elpis carried a sense closer to oriented anticipation, not wishful thinking, not passive waiting. A directed quality of attention toward what has not yet arrived, but whose arrival is already implicit in present conditions. This is a cognitive state that psychologists have studied extensively under the term prospective cognition, the brain's capacity to generate representations of possible futures. The difference between adaptive prospective cognition and maladaptive worry is precisely the quality the Gnostics were trying to name with Elpis, the direction of the anticipation. Elpis faces toward expansion, fear faces toward contraction. Both are prospective states. The substrate is identical, the orientation is inverted. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century and quoted by Irenaeus in the Adversus Heresies, describes Elpis as the emanation that gives the soul the capacity to move forward into the pleroma, the fullness, without yet being fully there. She is the bridge state, the quality of consciousness that makes progress possible, precisely because she holds the reality of arrival without demanding its immediate materialization. What Ptolemy preserves of the original teaching, even in the hostile framing of Irenaeus's refutation, is the functional description. Elpis is not about the content of what is hoped for. She is about the phenomenological quality of the hoping itself. Elpis practiced correctly is a state of forward-facing openness that carries the same deactivation of defensive contractions as pistis, but adds directional quality, a vector. The third Aeon is agape, and here the departure from conventional understanding is perhaps the most dramatic of all 13. Agape is universally translated as love, and in mainstream theological usage, both Christian and comparative religion, it is placed in contrast with eros, erotic love, and philia, friendship love, as the highest, most spiritual, most selfless form of love. A love without attachment, a love without desire, a love that gives without needing return. This is a profound misreading of the original Gnostic usage, and it is a misreading with consequences. In the pistis Sophia, and in the broader Valentinian tradition, agape is not the absence of eros or the transcendence of desire. She is the state in which desire becomes conscious of its own source. The Gnostic agape is not selfless love. It is love that has discovered that the self is not bounded where conventional experience suggests it is. It is love that has followed desire all the way to its root, and found there not individual preference, but the original generative movement of the pleroma itself, the divine fullness reaching toward its own unfoldment. When you love from agape in this original sense, you are not transcending your desire. You're discovering that your desire at its deepest level is not yours. It is the Pleroma's desire to know itself through the encounter with form. This has enormous practical implications, and it resolves a paradox that most serious spiritual practitioners eventually encounter: the paradox of spiritual bypassing. The attempt to transcend desire, to love without attachment, frequently produces not liberation, but a more sophisticated form of control, a spiritually validated suppression of the body's genuine needs and hungers. The Gnostic tradition, at its most sophisticated, did not teach that the body's desires were errors to be transcended. It taught that they were the Pleroma's impulses filtered through the demiurge's constrictive architecture. The work was not to abolish the impulse, but to trace it back to its source, to follow desire home, past the distortions of the archonic system, to the original movement it derived from. Agape is the state you arrive at when you complete that tracing. The fourth emanation is synesis, a word that translates most precisely as understanding, but again, in a sense that the Greek carries and the English loses. Synesis in classical usage referred to a kind of understanding that involves the whole person, not just the intellect. It is cognate with the verb syniemi, to perceive, to comprehend, to bring together. Synesis is the aeon of integrated comprehension, the state in which intellectual understanding and embodied knowing are not separated but function as a single cognitive act. This is what neuroscientists now study under the heading of embodied cognition, a research program going back to the work of Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Elena Roche, whose 1991 book The Embodied Mind essentially reinvented cognitive science by insisting that cognition is not a brain-based computation, but a full-body process extending into the environment. What the Gnostic teachers were describing with synesis is what contemporary neuroscience is just beginning to articulate: that the deepest forms of understanding are not propositional. They cannot be reduced to statements that are true or false. They are enacted through the body's engagement with reality in a way that produces not just knowledge about something, but knowledge that is inseparable from the knower's transformed relationship to what is known. When you truly understand something in the synesis sense, you are different afterward. The understanding changes you. This is different from learning a fact, and it is different from intellectual insight, which can leave the body entirely unchanged. Synesis is the Aeon who governs the comprehension that transforms. The fifth emanation carries the name Makariotes, a Greek term usually translated as blessedness, the same root from which the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew derive their structure. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the conventional translation reads. But the Greek Makarios carried a meaning in the classical period that was closer to what we might call profound okayness, a state of fundamental sufficiency that does not depend on external circumstances. Aristotle discussed it in relation to eudaimonia, the good-souled condition he considered the highest human achievement. The Epicureans pursued ataraxia, undisturbedness, as its secular equivalent. What the Gnostic tradition understood that both of these frameworks missed is that Makariotes is not achieved. It is restored. It is not a state produced by correct action or correct philosophy. It is a state that was always already present underneath the overlay of the archonic system. The overlay of lack, of insufficientness, of the perpetual sense that something essential is missing, that the material world's architecture produces in every human being born into it. Makariotes' practice is therefore not about achieving a state, but about removing what obscures a state that is already present. This is subtler than it sounds, and the distinction has practical consequences. If you approach your practice as an effort to achieve blessedness, you have already presupposed a lack. You're already operating within the archonic framework of insufficientness that Makariotes dissolves. The practice has to begin with the recognition that what you're trying to reach is not distant. It is present. it is simply covered. And the covering, in Gnostic understanding, is not sin or failure or karma in the popular sense. It is the layer of constructed identity, the composite self built from archonic inputs, from social conditioning, from the accumulated narrative of who you have been told you are, that sits between your awareness and the makariotes that is your original condition. The specific practice the tradition associates with makariotes is an inquiry practice that has more in common with Ramana Maharshi's method of self-inquiry than with conventional meditation. And this parallel is not accidental, because both traditions are working with the same fundamental insight about the constructed nature of the experienced self. The inquiry is not who am I in the discursive sense. It is a direct investigation of the felt sense of insufficiency whenever it arises. Where in the body does the sense of not enough live? What is its texture, its location, its quality as pure sensation stripped of narrative? When you follow that sensation all the way to its edge, to the boundary where the sensation ends and whatever is on the other side of it begins, you find not emptiness but the makariotes that was there before the sensation was constructed. The sixth emanation, phronesis, is the aeon of practical wisdom, and the word is Aristotle's, adopted and transformed by the Gnostic tradition. For Aristotle, phronesis was the intellectual virtue that governed practical action, the capacity to discern the right thing to do in the specific circumstances of a particular situation, rather than applying a universal rule mechanically. This is a sophisticated concept in moral philosophy, and Aristotle's treatment of it in the Nicomachean Ethics remains one of the most nuanced accounts of practical reasoning in Western thought. What the Gnostic tradition did with it was locate phronesis not in the intellect but in what they called the pneuma, the spiritual element in the human being that is, in their cosmology, of the same substance as the pleroma itself. Pneumatic phronesis is not the calculation of best action by an individual reasoner. It is the direct perception of right action by a consciousness that has sufficient clarity to see situation as it actually is, stripped of the archonic distortions that the demiurge's architecture imposes. The archons in Gnostic cosmology distort human perception through what the tradition called haimamin, fate, or more precisely, the system of conditioned causality that makes certain actions seem necessary and certain possibilities seem invisible. Phronesis cuts through haimamene. She is the Aeon who, when contacted, makes visible the choices that conditioned consciousness cannot see. Not because she provides supernatural information, but because she restores the perceptual clarity that conditioned consciousness has occluded. In terms of contemporary cognitive science, phronesis corresponds to the state of reduced automaticity, the condition in which behavior is no longer driven by habitual pattern matching, but is genuinely chosen from a position of clear perception. This is what researchers like Ellen Langer at Harvard have studied under the heading of mindlessness and mindfulness, and what Daniel Kahneman's framework of System 1 and System 2 thinking addresses from a different angle. Phronesis is not System 2, not deliberate, effortful calculation. She's something closer to what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described as the state of flow, effortless, appropriate action arising from full engagement with the actual situation. The Gnostic insight is that this state is not accidental. It is not produced by skill alone. It is the natural mode of a consciousness that has shed enough of the archonic overlay to perceive clearly. The seventh Aeon is Dynamis, whose name means power, and here we encounter what may be the most misunderstood concept in the entire Gnostic cosmological system. Power in the Gnostic tradition is not domination. It is not the capacity to impose one's will on external circumstances or other beings. Dynamis is the power of the pleroma itself, the originary generative force that produces the Aeons as its natural expression. It is not power over anything. It is power as the primordial act of expression itself, the divine capacity to bring forth, to manifest, to give form to what is formless. The distinction matters practically because most human beings who seek power, including many who seek it through spiritual practice, are seeking domination power, the capacity to not be at the mercy of circumstances. This is the archonic concept of power, and it makes sense as a response to the archonic system, which does function through domination and subjection. But dynamis power is categorically different. It is the power of generativity rather than dominance. It does not assert itself against resistance, it does not overpower, it simply creates, and what it creates is real in a way that domination power's achievements never quite are, because domination power always creates in reaction to something external, while dynamis power creates from what the tradition calls the pleroma's own abundance. One of the clearest contemporary framings of this distinction comes from the work of David R. Hawkins, whose map of consciousness, first published in Power Versus Force in 1995, drew on kinesiology and attractor field theory to argue that different states of consciousness have fundamentally different modes of relation to the world, and that states characterized by what he called power, meaning intrinsic generativity, are categorically more effective than states characterized by what he called force, meaning externally directed effort against resistance. Whatever one thinks of Hawkins' specific theoretical framework and its scientific claims, the phenomenological distinction he identifies is real and is recognized by practitioners across traditions. Working with dynamis as an aeon is working with the condition of consciousness that the Pistis Sophia describes as the state in which creation becomes natural, in which the soul's natural emanating quality is restored to function, no longer choked by the defensive contractions of the archonic overlay. The eighth aeon is Thronos, the aeon of the throne, which is not a place but a relationship. In the Pistis Sophia's cosmological architecture, the throne is not a location of authority in the conventional sense. It is the specific relationship between the emanator and the emanated that makes hierarchy stable without being dominating. The Thronos Aeon governs the quality of consciousness that can hold position, can occupy a particular place in a structure without either collapsing into servility below it or grasping for dominance above it. This is a social and psychological quality that contemporary researchers study under the heading of secure attachment, and what organizational psychologists call non-anxious presence. Edwin Friedman, the family therapist and organizational consultant who developed the concept of non-anxious presence from Murray Bowen's family systems theory, described it as the capacity to remain a differentiated self in the midst of relational systems that exert pressure toward either fusion or flight. This is precisely the Thronos quality, the capacity to be present in a structure without losing oneself to it. The aeon of the throne is the emanation that teaches the soul how to be somewhere, how to inhabit position without the position becoming either a trap or a weapon. The ninth aeon is Irene, and her name is peace, but the Greek Irene, like the Hebrew shalom from which it partly derives, means something much richer than the absence of conflict. It means the presence of right relationship. Shalom describes a state in which every part of a system is in its appropriate relation to every other part, a dynamic equilibrium that is not static but alive. Irene in the Pistis Sophia tradition is the aeon who governs the restoration of right relationship between the individual soul and the pleroma, but also between different aspects of the individual's own consciousness and between the individual and other beings in their life. Contemporary relational psychology has produced research supporting the idea that coherent social connection is not just emotionally but neurologically constitutive of healthy individual function. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, developed across a series of papers from 1994 onward, demonstrated that the mammalian nervous system has a specific, evolutionarily recent circuit, the ventral vagal complex, that supports states of social engagement, and that these states are not merely pleasant additions to individual function, but are actually required for the nervous system to operate in its most capable register. The Irene state, what Porges would call the ventral vagal engaged state, is not a reward for correct practice. In the Gnostic framing, it is the condition of consciousness in right relationship with the pleroma, and the experience of isolation, disconnection, and social anxiety that the archonic system produces in human beings is not natural. It is the result of a system that, as the Pistis Sophia describes, deliberately disrupts right relationship because isolated, anxious, disconnected individuals are far more susceptible to archonic control than individuals who are in genuine communion with one another and with the divine source. The 10th Aeon has no common name in the surviving texts. She is referred to in the Pistis Sophia by her function, the one who is being restored, and this is itself significant because her namelessness is not a gap in the tradition. It is a description of a specific state. She is the Aeon who corresponds to the moment in the soul's journey at which the previous 9 have done enough work that something begins to reconstitute itself that had no name because it had never been fully present in the human consciousness that needed it. She is restoration before naming is possible. This concept is foreign to most Western spiritual frameworks, but is deeply familiar to indigenous and shamanic traditions that work with what is sometimes called soul retrieval, the practice of recovering dissociated aspects of the self that split off under conditions of trauma. Michael Harner, the anthropologist whose work with Foundation for Shamanic Studies beginning in the 1980s systematized core shamanism practice, documented extensively that shamanic practitioners across culture describe a process of soul recovery that is not about adding something new, but about restoring something that was always the practitioner's, but that has been inaccessible. The 10th Aeon governs this process at the cosmological level. She is the divine quality of consciousness that corresponds to the moment of recovery, the breath that comes back, the sense of self that reconstitutes, the something that returns when enough of the defensive overlay has been removed by contact with the preceding 9. The 11th Aeon is Sophia in her lower manifestation, what the Pistis Sophia carefully distinguishes from Sophia in her original state. This is one of the most theologically sophisticated moves in the entire text, and it is one that many popular treatments of Gnostic Sophia mythology flatten into a simple fallen redemption narrative that misses the point. The Pistis Sophia does not present Sophia as a figure who fell and then returned to where she was. She presents Sophia as a figure who fell and who returns transformed, who returns having integrated the experience of limitation, of the material world, of the archonic condition, and who is therefore more fully herself than she was before the descent began. This is not a minor theological distinction. It is the cosmological foundation for the entire tradition's understanding of why embodiment in the material world is not simply an error or a trap. If Sophia's descent through the Aeons and her encounter with the Demiurge's domain were simply negative, simply a disaster to be reversed, then the spiritual path would be nothing more than escape. But the Pistis Sophia presents the descent as purposive. Sophia goes into the material world because something of the pleroma needs to be present there. Something needs to be carried into the domain of the Demiurge that the Demiurge himself cannot generate. The actual living quality of the pleroma's generativity, which can only be planted in the material world through a being who consents to take on the conditions of that world. This is why the Sophia who returns in the 11th Aeon position is placed after the unnamed 10th. The 10th Aeon, the restoration without name, is the moment at which Sophia is constituting herself again. The 11th Aeon is Sophia reconstituted, Sophia who has been through the entire cycle of emanation, limitation, descent, and recovery, and who is now present in the cosmos not as an unfallen purity, but as a being who knows what limitation is from the inside, and who has brought back from that knowing something that the pleroma, in its original fullness, could not have known about itself. For practitioners, Contact with the 11th Aeon, Sophia in her restored form, is qualitatively different from contact with the Sophia of popular Gnostic spirituality, the Sophia who is simply the feminine divine before she fell. The restored Sophia carries in her frequency what practitioners consistently describe as a quality of having been through, a resilience that is not hardness, a wisdom that is not abstraction, an understanding of darkness that does not darken. She is the model for what the Pistis Sophia presents as the ultimate outcome of the human spiritual path. Not escape from experience, but integration of the full range of experience into a selfhood that is larger than what was available before the descent began. The 12th Aeon is Pistis again, but at a higher octave. The Pistis Sophia explicitly structures the sequence this way. The first Aeon and the 12th share a name because they share a fundamental quality, but the relationship between them is not repetition. It is resolution. The first Pistis is the opening, the radical trust that makes the journey possible. The 12th Pistis is the trust that has been through the entire journey, and that now carries what the first could only anticipate. In musical terms, it is the return of the tonic after a full harmonic cycle. The same note, but everything that happened in between has transformed its meaning. This is also the Aeon that corresponds to what contemporary researchers in post-traumatic growth, a field pioneered by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina in the 1990s, describe as the specific quality of faith or trust that survivors of significant adversity who experience growth report. It is not the faith of people who have not suffered. It is not naive trust. It is trust that has been disconfirmed, that has gone through the experience of betrayal, of loss, of the material world's apparent indifference, and that has reconstituted itself on the other side. Tedeschi and Calhoun's research, replicated across dozens of studies in multiple countries, consistently shows that post-traumatic growth is not simply resilience, bouncing back to the prior state, but a genuine transformation to a state that is in measurable ways larger and more capable than the pre-trauma state. The 12th Aeon names this transformation cosmologically. She is the Pistis that could not have existed without the journey through the previous 11. The 13th position in the sequence is held by what the Pistis Sophia calls the First Mystery, a title that is itself a kind of name. She is the source from which all 13 emanate, and she is also their destination. She's not numbered with the 12 that precede her because she's not an element of the sequence in the same way. She's the condition of the sequence's possibility. She's what the Valentinian tradition would call the bythos, the depth, and what the Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text found at Nag Hammadi and dated to approximately 140 to 180 CE, calls the Father not in the sense of a masculine divine, but in the sense of the unoriginate source that precedes and sustains all emanation. The feminine character of this source, called the First Mystery, and placed at the head of a sequence of predominantly feminine aeons, has been largely obscured in modern treatments of Gnostic cosmology, but the Pistis Sophia's original framing, before the gender neutralization that institutional transmission imposed, presents the source as feminine, in precisely the sense that the Tao in Laozi's tradition is feminine, not in opposition to the masculine, but as the ground from which both masculine and feminine arise, the emptiness that is prior to and more generative than any of the specific forms it produces. The First Mystery is the womb of the Aeons, she who contains without constraining, who generates without diminishing, who is present in each of the 13 she produces without being reducible to any of them. The sequence from Pistis through the First Mystery is therefore not a list. It is a path, and understanding it as a path, as a specific itinerary through the interior landscape of human consciousness, moving in a direction that has been mapped by practitioners who actually travelled it, changes how you engage with each Aeon. They are not independent practices to be selected from a menu according to preference. They build on one another in the way that a musical key builds a chord from intervals that each depend on their relationship to the others for their full quality to emerge. The practical roadmap for working with the 13 over a sustained period follows the structure of the sequence itself. The first 7 days are given entirely to pistis, the opening practice described earlier, the simple 10-minute morning sitting with uncertainty. This is not because pistis is the least important Aeon and therefore disposable as a foundation. It is because the entire subsequent practice depends on the quality of opening that pistis establishes. If you begin Elpis practice before your relationship to uncertainty has softened sufficiently, the forward-facing orientation of Elpis will be immediately recruited by your anxiety architecture and will become planning rather than true orientation. The Archonic system is extraordinarily efficient at colonizing spiritual practices and converting them into more sophisticated versions of the same defensive patterns they were meant to dissolve. Days 8 through 14 are devoted to Elpis, with pistis continued in the background. The Elpis practice is an evening practice rather than a morning one, 5 minutes before sleep, holding an image or a felt sense of an open future. Not a specific desired outcome, but the sensation of moving towards something. The body knows this sensation. It is the sensation of walking toward a destination you have not yet reached, but whose existence you do not doubt. The practice is to rest in that sensation without populating it with content. Let the felt sense of forward orientation be present without immediately filling it with the specifics of what you want or fear about the future. Days 15 through 21. Agape is introduced, and this is where most practitioners encounter their first significant obstacle. Agape practice requires a willingness to follow desire rather than transcend it, and for people who have been working in spiritual traditions that pathologize desire, this feels like regression. The instruction is simple but counterintuitive. Find something you genuinely desire, and instead of moving toward it practically or pushing it away spiritually, follow the sensation of the desire itself inward. Where does it live in the body? What is its quality as pure sensation? Beneath the specific content of the desire, beneath the particular thing wanted, what is the texture of the wanting itself? Follow that texture, go deeper into it rather than away from it. What you find beneath the specific content of desire, every practitioner who completes this investigation consistently reports, is not something ugly or shameful. It is something recognizable as love. Not love for the specific thing desired, love as the condition of desiring anything at all. This is agape. This is the discovery that your desire and the pleroma's generativity are made of the same substance. The synesis practice, occupying days 22 through 28, is best engaged through embodied learning rather than contemplative sitting. Learn something with your body during this week. Not a purely intellectual skill, but something that requires the body's participation, a physical art form, a craft, a movement practice, cooking something complex. The instruction is to pay attention to the quality of understanding that arises through the body's engagement with the learning, separate from any verbal or conceptual formulation of what is being learned. Notice when you know something in your hands before you know it in your head. That anterior knowing, the knowledge that precedes its own articulation, is synesis. The practice is not to produce her, but to notice when she is already present, and to dwell in that noticing long enough that it becomes a recognizable state, rather than a fleeting quality of experience. Makariotes occupies the 5th week, and the practice is the inquiry described earlier. It is worth adding at this stage a specific instruction that practitioners who have worked through the first 4 Aeons before reaching Makariotes find meaningful, bring the quality of pistis's openness, Elpis's orientation, Agape's desire tracing, and Synesis's embodied knowing to the inquiry itself. The Makariote's inquiry is not a cold philosophical exercise. It is an investigation conducted by a consciousness that has already been softened and opened by the 4 preceding practices. The insufficiency sensation, when examined by such a consciousness, reveals itself differently than it would to a consciousness that has not been prepared by the preceding work. The phronesis practice of the 6th week is the most social of the 13. The instruction is to engage in one significant decision or situation each day with the explicit intention of perceiving before acting, to spend a minimum of 30 seconds before responding to any situation that would ordinarily trigger an automatic response, in the quality of clear seeing that phronesis governs. This is not a pause for deliberation, it is a pause for perception. The difference is that deliberation mobilizes the analytical mind to evaluate options, while the phronesis pause is a quieting of the analytical mind in order to allow perception of what is actually present, what the situation actually requires, rather than what the conditioned self assumes it requires. The dynamis practice of the 7th week is creative. The instruction is to create something each day, not necessarily something large or finished or perfect, but something that did not exist before. The form does not matter. Write a paragraph, draw a figure, arrange objects in a way that feels expressive, prepare food with conscious attention to what is being brought forth. The instruction is to bring the dynamis awareness to the act of creation. The awareness that what is being expressed is not your individual creativity, but the pleroma's generative impulse, moving through the particular instrument of your particular body and life. This is not a grandiose claim about channeling. It is a perceptual practice, noticing that creativity, when it's actually happening rather than being performed or forced, feels like something coming through you rather than something you are producing. That phenomenological quality, the experience of being the instrument rather than the agent, is the dynamis state. The remaining 6 Aeons are worked in pairs over 3 weeks, Thronos and Irene together, since they address related dimensions of relational consciousness. The unnamed 10th and the 11th Sophia together, since they address the adjacent themes of restoration and integration. And the 12th Pistis and the first mystery together, since the return to Pistis at a higher octave and the encounter with the source are experiences that belong in the same contemplative field. The Thronos Irene week is devoted to relationship as practice. The instruction is to engage in at least one significant conversation each day with conscious attention to 2 things: how you hold your position in the relational field, Thronos, and whether the conversation moves toward or away from right relationship, Irene. Neither of these is about being correct or kind in a conventional sense. Thronos asks whether you are genuinely present as yourself, not performing a role, not disappearing into accommodation, while simultaneously remaining in genuine contact with the other person. Irene asks whether the conversation ends in a place of greater coherence than it began, whether something true has been acknowledged or clarified or met in a way that leaves both participants more in contact with reality than they were before. The Restoration Week, the 10th and 11th Aeons, involves a practice borrowed from the journal tradition of the late Trappist monk Thomas Merton, adapted for this specific purpose. The instruction is to write each morning for 15 minutes without editing or self-consciousness, answering a single question: what has been returned to me that I did not expect to recover? This is not a gratitude practice. Although it may produce gratitude, it is an investigation of the phenomenon of restoration, of the specific experiences of recovering access to something that seemed permanently lost. Over a week of this practice, most practitioners discover that they have had more experiences of recovery and restoration than their ordinary memory preserves. The 10th Aeon works by making restoration visible. The 11th, Sophia in her restored form, works by helping the practitioner recognize what has been integrated from the experience of loss that was not present before the loss. The final week, the 12th pistis and the first mystery, is the simplest and the most demanding. The practice is silence. Not the absence of words, but the quality of awareness that precedes the impulse towards expression. Each morning for 30 minutes, rest in that quality. Not meditating on anything, not maintaining any particular posture of attention. Simply resting in the awareness that is present before thought, before the construction of the practice self, before the archonic overlay assembles itself into the day's particular configuration of identity and agenda. The 12th pistis is what you find when you go all the way into that silence. The first mystery is what holds the silence. They cannot be distinguished from each other at this depth, and that inability to distinguish them, that meeting of the end and the beginning, is the experience the pistis Sophia is pointing toward with its entire structure. Practitioners who complete the 13-week cycle consistently report a set of changes that do not fit neatly into any single experiential category. The changes are not dramatic in the sense of sudden transformations. They are shifts in the basic quality of ordinary experience. The sense of isolation, the archonic isolation that the system maintains by keeping consciousness convinced of its fundamental aloneness, diminishes without disappearing. The sense of urgency, the manufactured urgency of the demiurge's domain, the sense that there is always something to be afraid of, always something to be done before it is too late, also diminishes. What remains is not a state of calm indifference. What remains is a quality of engaged presence that the practitioners who have completed the cycle struggle to name, but that they consistently describe in related terms. More real, more here, less at the mercy of whatever is happening. Sarah Kay, a trauma therapist in Portland, Oregon, who incorporated elements of the 13 Aeon practice into her own personal practice while completing doctoral research in somatic trauma therapy, described the experience after her first full cycle this way. I kept waiting for the big shift, the spiritual revelation, the obvious change I could point to. What happened instead was that I started noticing how much energy I had previously spent bracing for things that weren't happening. Not past trauma, I'd done a lot of work on that, but anticipatory tension. The pistis practice in the first week loosened something in that, and by the time I got to the end, the baseline level of bracing had dropped significantly. I felt more in my body, less in my head, and simultaneously more capable of functioning in both. Marcus W., a former Jesuit seminarian who left religious life and subsequently spent a decade studying Valentinian and Scythian Gnostic texts before developing a practice framework that combined the textual tradition with contemporary somatic work, describes the 13th Aeon, the first mystery, as the most challenging to articulate and the most unmistakable to experience. It is not like the other 12. It is not a state you enter. It is a recognition that you have always been in it. The practice in that final week is less about accessing something new and more about removing the last of the assumption that you are outside it. The silence practice works because silence is the condition she has always been holding everything in. You are always in her. The archonic overlay made you forget that. The practice restores the memory. The research tradition that comes closest to formalizing what these practitioners describe is the contemplative neuroscience work coming out of institutions like the Mind and Life Institute, founded in 1987 through a collaboration between the Dalai Lama and the neuroscientist Francisco Varela. Researchers including Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Clifford Saron at UC Davis, whose Shamatha project followed intensive meditators over a 3-month retreat and documented changes in attention, emotional regulation, psychological well-being, and even cellular aging markers. And Willoughby Britton at Brown University, whose work documents both the positive effects and the genuine challenges of contemplative practice. all contribute to a picture of what sustained practice of this kind does to the nervous system, the immune system, the cognitive architecture. The specific pattern of change that the 13 Aeon cycle produces does not map perfectly onto what these researchers have documented in Buddhist-derived meditation practices, because the intentional structure is different. Buddhist practices, in their most widely studied forms, are largely practices of attention, of training the mind to stay with its object, whether that object is the breath, a koan, a visualization, or the nature of mind itself. The 13 Aeon practice is not primarily a practice of attention, it is a practice of encounter. The difference is phenomenologically significant. Attention training produces documented changes in the prefrontal cortex's regulatory capacity over limbic reactivity, better emotional regulation, improved sustained attention, reduced amygdala hyperreactivity. Encounter-based practice produces changes in the quality of the practitioner's relationship to experience itself, changes that are harder to measure with the instruments currently available to neuroscience, but that practitioners report with a consistency that suggests they are tracking something real. The obstacle most commonly encountered in the early stages of the practice, weeks 1 through 4, is the problem of abstraction. Many people who are drawn to this material come from backgrounds in intellectual spirituality. They have read widely, they're comfortable with concepts, and they approach the practice as an extension of their conceptual engagement with the tradition. The Pistis Sophia is a demanding text and rewards scholarly engagement, but the practice it encodes is not a scholarly practice. The Aeons cannot be contacted through conceptual understanding of them. They can only be contacted through the specific quality of open, embodied, present awareness that each practice is designed to produce. The abstraction problem manifests as a feeling of doing the practice correctly in a technical sense, while experiencing nothing, a competent performance of the outer form without any of the inner quality that gives it meaning. The solution to this obstacle is almost always to go more slowly and less ambitiously. The practitioners who get stuck in abstraction are typically trying to do too much too soon, trying to understand the whole system before they have allowed the first practice to do its work. The instruction at this point is to return to the Pistis practice and to stay with it until something actually shifts in the body's relationship to uncertainty. Not until you've understood the concept of Pistis more fully, until your body has actually moved. This distinction between conceptual mastery and somatic shift is the most important distinction in the entire practice, and it is one that the Gnostic tradition encoded in its choice to present the Aeons not as abstract principles, but as beings with names and faces, because you cannot encounter a named face with your intellect. You can only encounter a face with your whole self. The obstacle most commonly encountered in the middle stages, weeks 5 through 9, is a phenomenon the tradition calls kenosis, which in its conventional theological usage means self-emptying, and is associated with Christ's incarnation in Orthodox Christian theology, but which in the Gnostic usage refers to a specific experience that arises when enough of the constructed self has been removed by the preceding practices that the practitioner encounters a temporary experience of void, not the peace-filled emptiness that advanced practice eventually produces, but a destabilizing sense of groundlessness, a sense that the structures one relied on to know who one was are no longer fully operational. This can be frightening, and without a framework that contextualizes it, it can appear to be evidence that the practice is not working, or that something has gone wrong. In fact, it is evidence that the practice is working. The tradition describes this experience as the encounter with the 11th Aeon before she's ready to be encountered, as touching the edge of Sophia's restoration, before the preceding Aeons have done enough work to stabilize the contact. The instruction when this arises is to return to Makariot's practice, the sufficiency inquiry, and to spend additional time there before proceeding. Macariotes is the Aeon who stabilizes the practice, precisely because she addresses the sense of fundamental insufficientness that makes kenosis frightening. If the practitioner has genuinely contacted Macariotes, if the felt sense of sufficiency beneath the archonic overlay of lack has been reliably accessed, even briefly, the kenosis experience becomes navigable. The groundlessness stops being a threat and becomes, as the tradition describes it, the beginning of the encounter with the 10th Aeon, the restoration of what was always there, becoming accessible through the removal of what was layered over it. The later stages of the practice, weeks 10 through 13, present a different kind of challenge. The destabilization of the middle period gives way, for most practitioners, to a quality of experience that can only be described as ordinary made luminous. The dramatic experiences of the early and middle stages, the body shifts, the kenosis, the unexpected emotions that arise and release during the Agape and Sophia weeks, tend to settle into something quieter and more pervading. The archonic overlay, having been progressively softened, does not disappear. It is still there. The cultural conditioning, the habitual patterns, the inherited narratives about who one is and what is possible, none of these vanish in 13 weeks. What changes is the relationship to them. They become more visible as constructs rather than more transparent as windows onto reality. And that shift in visibility, the capacity to see the overlay as overlay rather than taking it for reality itself, is itself the restoration that the Pistis Sophia is pointing toward. The Valentinian teacher Theodotus, whose sayings were preserved by Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century CE, described the ultimate outcome of Gnostic practice in terms that resonate precisely with what contemporary practitioners of the 13 Aeon cycle report. The question is not who we were or who we are, but to what place we are hastening. And the word he uses for hastening is not urgency, but direction. The freed soul does not flee. It moves toward what it already knows to be its home. This is the quality that the completion of the 13 Aeon cycle tends to produce in practitioners who have engaged with it seriously and sustained it through its challenges. Not the dramatic liberation of sudden awakening, but the quiet, reliable, unspectacular orientation toward the pleroma that characterizes a consciousness that has begun to remember what it was before the archonic overlay obscured it. The Nag Hammadi text known as the Gospel of Philip, probably composed in the 2nd or 3rd century CEE in Syria, contains a passage that both summarizes what the 13 Aeon practice is working toward and points to the long-term trajectory of the path beyond the initial cycle. The Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a redemption and a bridal chamber. Scholars of the Valentinian tradition, particularly Philip Lee in his 1988 work against the Protestant Gnostics, and more recently Dylan Burns in his 2014 Apocalypse of the Alien God, have argued that these 5 terms refer not to metaphors for inner states, but to specific practices that the Valentinian communities actually performed. The bridal chamber, the eros gamos, the sacred union, is the practice that most directly corresponds to the work of the 13th Aeon. It is the practice of the soul's recognition of its union with the pleroma, not achieved through external ceremony, but as the direct outcome of the sequence of encounter with the preceding 12. This long-term trajectory, the movement from the opening of pistis practice through the full 13 and into what the tradition calls the bridal chamber, is not a 13-week project that ends and produces a result. It is, in the Gnostic framing, the work of a lifetime. Practitioners who have completed multiple cycles of the 13 Aeon sequence report that each cycle goes deeper than the last, that contacts that were intellectual in the first cycle become somatic in the second, somatic contacts become relational in the third, and relational contacts eventually become what the tradition would call pneumatic, genuinely participatory in the life of the pleroma, rather than simply open to it as an external influence. The tradition that preserves this knowledge is not dead. It didn't end when the church councils ordered the destruction of Gnostic texts in the 4th century. It went underground, and it has remained underground, carried by small communities and individual practitioners who preserved the essential elements not always in explicit Gnostic language, but in the preserved practices and lived insights of lineages that kept the functional core even when the framework was adapted to survive in different cultural contexts. The Mandean tradition, still practiced today in communities primarily in Iraq, Iran and the diaspora, preserves what scholars, including Jorunn Jacobsen Buckley, have argued is one of the oldest surviving Gnostic practice traditions, with a relationship to the divine feminine embedded in their ritual practice of masbuta, running water baptism, that carries direct functional parallels to the Aeon contact work of the Pistis Sophia tradition. The Druze tradition, whose relationship to Gnostic and Ismaili philosophy has been documented by researchers including Sami Nasib Makarem, preserves an understanding of divine emanation that retains the relational, feminine character of the original Aeon theology in ways that the mainstream Islamicization of the broader region could not fully assimilate. In the contemporary Western context, the revival of serious engagement with Gnostic practice, as distinct from academic study of Gnostic history, has been building since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 and has accelerated since the full translations became widely available in the 1970s and 1980s. Stefan Höhler, the Gnostic bishop and scholar whose 1989 work The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead established a framework for understanding Jung's own engagement with Gnostic material as a psychological and spiritual practice, has been a significant figure in this revival. His Ecclesia Gnostica in Los Angeles, one of the few communities that has consistently maintained both scholarly rigor and living ritual practice in the Gnostic tradition, provides a contemporary example of what sustained engagement with this material looks like in community rather than individual practice. The question of community is not incidental to the practice. The archonic system functions partly through isolation, through the enforcement of the sense that each person is fundamentally alone, that their spiritual experience is private and unverifiable, that the communities through which shared practice might be stabilized and deepened are either unavailable or untrustworthy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of a real dynamic that anyone who has tried to maintain a serious spiritual practice in the modern world recognizes from experience. The practices that change the most are the ones maintained in community, not because community validates them, but because community provides the relational field in which the Iranian Thronos Aeons specifically do their most significant work. You cannot fully contact the Aeon of right relationship in isolation. You need other people for the practice to be complete. If you have engaged with the material in this text and found something in it that resonates beyond intellectual interest, if you have found yourself wanting to try the practices rather than simply understanding them, that resonance is information. The Gnostic tradition would say it is the pleroma's recognition of itself in you, expressed through the specific vehicle of these particular teachings reaching you at this particular moment. A secular framing would say simply that certain knowledge arrives at the right time because the readiness to receive it was already present. Either way, the response is the same. Begin, not dramatically, not with the certainty that you have found the final answer. Begin with the Pistis practice, 7 mornings, 10 minutes. Sit with what is most uncertain in your life. Do not solve it. Do not accept it. Simply allow it to be present while you continue to breathe. That is the door. Everything else described in this text is what lies beyond it. But the door is not theoretical, and it does not require any particular set of prior beliefs or credentials or initiatory heritage to open. It requires only what the first Aeon has always required: the willingness to remain open to what is actually present, without the preemptive armoring that the archonic system spent your entire life teaching you to maintain. After completing the 7-day Pistis Foundation, return to this text and begin the Elpis practice. Let the sequence guide you. Note what you experience, not for the purpose of evaluating whether you're doing it correctly, but for the purpose of tracking the specific changes in how ordinary experience registers in the body and mind. Practitioners have kept practice journals in every tradition that takes development seriously, not because experience needs to be recorded to count, but because the act of articulating experience in writing deepens and consolidates the contact. Write briefly after each session. Not a spiritual diary in the elevated sense, simply what was present, what shifted, what was difficult, what remains unclear. The Pistis Sophia preserved what it preserved across 17 centuries of active suppression, because the people who carried it understood what was at stake. Not for themselves, most of them did not survive the carrying, for the people who would eventually receive it. The people in every generation who felt the pull towards something that the available spiritual frameworks could not fully satisfy, who knew that what they were being offered was structurally sound but functionally empty, who kept reaching for something that had been removed from the tradition before they arrived in it. One of the most important things to understand about working with this tradition in the present moment is that the suppression of the feminine Aeons was not a single event. It was a process, and like all historical processes, it was uneven. Not every line of transmission was completely emptied. In the cracks between the dominant tradition, fragments survived in forms that the suppression could not easily identify as dangerous because they had been translated into the language and imagery of what was permitted. The troubadour tradition of medieval Provence, with its intense devotion to the domna, the lady, as a figure of transcendent significance that exceeded any individual woman, preserves in its encoded poetic language what scholars including Denis de Rougemont in Love in the Western World, and more recently Barbara Newman in God, and the Goddesses have argued is a strand of the divine feminine tradition that Catharism, itself a medieval revival of Gnostic theology, carried westward. The Catha Perfecti of the 12th and 13th centuries, centred in the Languedoc and systematically destroyed by the Albigensian Crusade beginning in 1209, maintained a theology of the divine feminine that was explicitly connected to the Pistis Sophia tradition. They called her Sophia. They understood the material world as the domain of the demiurge. They practiced a form of purification, the consolamentum, that was understood as a restoration of the pneuma to its original pleramatic condition. The Albigensian Crusade killed an estimated 500,000 people over 20 years. The Cathar communities were largely destroyed, but the transmission did not end. It moved into different containers. The Minnesingers carried it in music. The alchemical tradition, from Jabir ibn Hayyan in the 8th century through Paracelsus in the 16th, and into the work of the early Royal Society figures like Sickelmeier, carried it in the language of the transformation of matter, where the feminine principle was always present as the prima materia, the originary stuff that the alchemical work brought from lead to gold. Carl Jung, whose mid-20th century work on the psychology of the unconscious drew extensively on alchemical symbolism, recognized in this tradition what he called the anima, the soul figure, the inner feminine, the relational principle of the psyche that was not ego and was not superego, but was something that mediated between consciousness and the deeper, vaster reality that consciousness was part of. His reading of the alchemical tradition, developed across Mysterium Conjunctionis, psychology and alchemy, and his memoir Memories, Dreams, Reflections, arrived at conclusions about the structure of the psyche that are more congruent with the Gnostic Aeon framework than most Jungian scholars have been comfortable acknowledging. The relationship between the 13 Aeons and the structure of the human psyche, the question of whether the Aeons are best understood as cosmological entities, as psychological archetypes, or as both simultaneously, is one of the genuinely unresolved questions in this field, and it is worth dwelling with it rather than resolving it prematurely. The Gnostic tradition itself was not uniform on this question. The Sethian tradition, represented in texts like Zostrianos, Allogenes, and the 3 steles of Seth, all found at Nag Hammadi, tended toward a more metaphysical reading of the Aeons as literal cosmic realities that the soul encounters in its ascent through the heavens. The Valentinian tradition, by contrast, tended toward what scholars call a more psychological reading, in which the cosmological drama is understood as a description of what happens in the soul's own interior rather than in a literally spatial cosmos. The Pistis Sophia sits somewhere between these poles. Its cosmological elaboration is highly specific and clearly meant as more than metaphor, but its practical orientation, its concern with what the soul can do, what practices can be performed, what changes can be effected, gives it a functional character that aligns more with the Valentinian approach. For contemporary practitioners, the productive approach seems to be to hold both registers simultaneously, rather than choosing between them. Work with the Aeons as if they are real, as if Pistis is a genuine presence you can orient toward, as if Elpis is an actual quality of consciousness rather than a concept about it, as if the 13 together form a living map of a train that you can navigate. Work with them this way without insisting on a specific metaphysical account of what exactly they are. The phenomenological test, what happens in experience when you engage with the practices, is more reliable than any prior theoretical commitment, and it is the test that every serious practitioner from Valentinus himself through the contemporary inheritors of the tradition has applied. The Gnostic tradition was always primarily empirical in this sense. Not empirical in the modern scientific sense of controlled experiments and third-person observation, but empirical in the original sense of grounded in experience, tested against the practitioner's direct perception of what actually happens. What actually happens across the range of contemporary practitioners who have worked seriously with the 13 Aeon sequence is consistent enough in its broad outlines and varied enough in its specific details to suggest that the practice is tracking something real. The broad outlines, a progressive softening of the defensive overlay that the archonic system maintains around ordinary consciousness, an increase in what practitioners describe as being here, a specific change in the quality of relationship, both with other people and with one's own experience, and eventually a stabilized shift in what might be called the center of gravity of identity, the place from which the sense of self operates, from the constructed, defended, archonically conditioned composite self to something that is more continuous, more spacious, and less at the mercy of what the world throws at it. Not invulnerable, not beyond suffering or difficulty, but genuinely different in its relationship to these, larger than what they can contain. The specific details vary enormously, and this variation is itself part of what suggests that the practices are working with something intrinsic to each practitioner's particular configuration of consciousness, rather than simply inducing a standard altered state. Two people who complete the same 13-week cycle in the same order with the same practices will report experiences that are recognizably related but unmistakably individual. This is consistent with what the tradition says about the Aeons, that they are encountered not as fixed experiences, but as qualities that meet each soul in its specific condition and produce an interaction that is unique to that meeting. The Aeon does not stamp a standard impression onto every soul it contacts. It brings its quality into contact with the soul's quality, and what emerges from that contact is the specific transformation that this particular soul needed from this particular Aeon at this particular moment. This is why no text, however complete, and no teacher, however accomplished, can fully substitute for the practice itself. The map is real, the tradition is real, the scholarly context is real, and matters because it protects the practice from the kind of appropriative distortion that plucks techniques out of their framework and deploys them for purposes the framework was designed to transcend. But the practice is irreducibly yours. It is the encounter between your consciousness and the Aeons that produces liberation. Not reading about it, not understanding it conceptually, not finding a community that validates your interest. The practice itself done sincerely, without performance, without the expectation of dramatic experience, in the quietness of whatever 10 minutes of morning you can preserve from the archonic system's relentless claim on your attention. That is where this begins, and where it ends. The tradition does not fully specify, because what the tradition describes as the destination is the same as the source, the first mystery, the original fullness from which all 13 Aeons emanate, the silence that holds everything, including the silence itself. You are never outside it. You will never leave it. The practice is simply the memory of that, recovered name by name, face by face, through the 13 who were always there, waiting to be recognized through the centuries of erasure that could not ultimately erase them. Because you cannot erase what is constitutive of the consciousness that would do the erasing. The 13 Aeons were removed from human consciousness one name at a time. They are restored the same way: Pistis, Elpis, Agape, Synesis, Makariotes, Phronesis, Dynamis, Thronos, Irene, the Unnamed One, Sophia restored, Pistis again, the first mystery, all 13, in sequence, beginning now. What you encounter in 7 days of genuine Pistis practice, not the performance of the practice, but the actual quality of opening it produces, will be different from anything this text can predict for you. That is by design. The practice is designed to produce not the experience described in texts, but the experience that arises from your specific consciousness encountering the specific Aeon at this specific moment in your life. The texts are maps, you are the terrain. The 13 Aeons are what waits to be discovered in you when you have the tools and the willingness to look. Share what you find in the 7 days of Pistis practice. Not for validation, not to demonstrate that you are the kind of person who takes this seriously, but because the practice of articulating experience, of bringing the wordless into words while maintaining contact with what the words are pointing toward, is itself a form of the Synesis Aeon at work, and because other practitioners at different stages of the same path are more useful to one another than any teacher can be. The tradition was always transmitted through encounter. The Pistis Sophia itself is structured as a dialogue, as a conversation between a teacher and students who are genuinely changed by the exchange. That model is not accidental. It is the transmission technology the tradition chose because it is the one that works. Try the 7-day Pistis practice, then return,